A very, very good morning. Welcome back to, or rather, welcome to the second edition of the show. You're hanging with me, Sarah, and I am super, super excited to be here right here on the sunrise. I'll be keeping you company all the way until 9 a.m. And I am, in fact, super excited to be here because it is a beautiful Tuesday morning. And like I said, my favorite part about the new week is the fact that I get to count how many more days are there until the weekend, right? That's like my favorite part of the entire week, and that's honestly why I look forward to the week, unlike most of us, because most of us, we hate Mondays, right? We hate having to go to work on Mondays and start working all over again on Monday. And honestly, it is tiring, and I completely understand that. And that's why, to sort of motivate me and to keep me going during the rest of the week, I keep counting the days until the weekend, because you know what? It's a fun thing to do, okay? But you're hanging with me, Sarah, right here on the sunrise. And like I said, I'm super, super excited to be here because I do have a lot of interesting content to be talking about you with, okay? So make sure you stay tuned and make sure you go follow us on our socials, which is Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. And that way you can stay updated rather. You can be informed about everything that's happening all around in the world, but also in the United Kingdom as well. So make sure you do that, because that way, our goal here at Relax Radio is to make sure that you are always informed, that you're updated on everything that's happening in the world, and that also you're the first person to know everything that happens in the world. So make sure you stay tuned, because that way you can actually be the first to know everything that happens, okay? So make sure you do that. But also want to quickly remind you that you can download our app, which is available on both the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. And that way you can actually be a part of this conversation anytime you want, right? Because regardless of whether it's 3 in the morning, regardless of whether it's 5 in the afternoon, or evening rather, you can always tune in to Relax Radio. You can always be a part of this conversation, and because we are in lockdown, we would all enjoy some conversation, right? So make sure you download that app. Make sure you always have Relax Radio with you, because obviously, as you know, we our priority is you. We care about you. So make sure you download our app, because that way we can care about you more, okay? And I also want to quickly remind you that you can in fact get in touch with me on the show if you have any thoughts, opinions, questions, experiences that you want to share with me. Make sure you text me on 078 and that way you can actually be a part of this conversation. And that's something I would love as well, because I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts and opinions on whatever we're talking right here on Relax Radio, where it's all about positives and no negatives, okay? So make sure you stay tuned. But let's get into today's topic. Let's get into our conversation for the first hour, which is basically how young people actually fear that poor mental health will affect post COVID job prospects. Now, obviously, that is a huge question that is currently there in the people, or, in young people right now, right? Because, like I said, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're going through so many different things. And obviously, it's only understandable that not poor people, but young people are worried about how their mental health will affect their jobs, especially when they're planning to get jobs. And this is important because right now, we have an economic recession. We're going through, we're going through some economic downfall, and in addition to that, there's a pandemic. And you know what happens when a pandemic is there, right? Obviously, it means things like anxiety, depression, stress, and everything, because you find it hard to actually survive during this pandemic, right? It's not a matter of survival, but I'm talking in terms of mental health. And I'm talking in terms of adjusting rather, to everything that is currently happening, to turning our lives around, to adjust ourselves to whatever is happening. Well, it's a bit tough. We've all been there. We're still there. Some of us are still trying to adjust to everything that's going on. So obviously, for a lot of young people, this is a huge worry for them, because they feel and they understand that their mental health might actually affect them when they are looking for more jobs, when they're looking to find new jobs. So we all had this question, especially when the pandemic started, whether we'll be able to concentrate again, whether we'll be able to focus the same way we used to. And you know what, we were all very distracted. It was very common, all of us, we were distracted, we experienced that. And even when we were doing very, very simple things like folding our laundry, or even researching something on our laptop or our phone, chances are you probably would get distracted, and then you'd end up going on social media and checking out, your social media feed or whatnot. I mean, I've been there, you've been there, we all have done that, right? So obviously, it's only normal and it's only understandable that young people also feel this as well. Now, if we actually take into consideration some of the restrictive measures that were put in place during the pandemic, and you couple that with the loneliness, the job and income loss, the bereavement, and the direct and the indirect impacts of COVID 19, you can actually see that it has, in fact, led to increased levels of anxiety. And it also has had a negative effect on a lot of people's mental health. And obviously, when we're talking about mental health, when we're talking about the pandemic and mental health, we know that the pandemic has had a huge impact on people's mental health, right? And we also need to understand that when it comes to this younger generation, when it comes to the young people of today's society, they're in fact struggling a lot, right? Now, obviously, we all know that a lot of us lost our jobs, a lot of us, didn't really have those same comforts and those same luxuries, if I put it that way. I mean, it's not necessarily luxury, but the fact that we were able to do things that we actually liked instead of having to do what is only necessary. We at least had that sort of freedom, right? We at least had that sort of choice. But however, right now, that is not the case. A lot of us had to deal with a lot of we had to deal with the fact that we lost our jobs. And in addition to losing our jobs, some of us lost our parents, our siblings, we lost our families. And obviously, it has been a very tough time. And in addition to the fact that, we've had to deal with all of this now, when we're thinking of moving on, when we're thinking of going to the future, and when we're thinking of, moving past this incident, and trying to rebuild our lives, trying to rebuild ourselves. Obviously, we have this question about how our past experience, our past trauma would actually affect our future. And that's completely normal. This isn't the first time it's happened. It's happened in like the past as well. So many different people, every time we go through, something traumatic, every time we go through something life changing, it tends to affect us. And sometimes, those effects trickle down to our future. If I put it that way, it trickles down to us. And actually, sometimes it affects our jobs. When it comes to the future, it affects our careers, and it affects our lives as well. So obviously, that's what we'll be talking about. We'll be talking about how young people actually have had to face a lot, and how the situation has in fact been much worse for them. And how, because of these problems that they're having with mental health, that they are in fact struggling to find future job prospects after COVID-19. Now, if you are a young person, or even if you know someone who's a young person, it really doesn't matter. You can get in touch with me, share their story, share their experience, because that is something we do right here on Relax Radio. Everyone listening in wants to know, your perspective, wants to know what you think about it, wants to know your thoughts and opinions on it as well. So make sure you text me on 07852473473, and it would be my absolute pleasure to actually tell it to everyone who's listening in as well. Because, like I said, we love to share our thoughts and opinions, and that actually helps us to have a better conversation. It helps us to have a bigger, better conversation with a lot of perspectives. And it's in fact a spectrum, if I put it that way. It's a spectrum. It's everyone's ideas, what everyone feels, what everyone thinks. We all share it right here on Relax Radio. So make sure you do that, okay? Not 7852473 is the number. So make sure you text me on the number and get in touch with me as well. Okay, now let's get back into our conversation. Now, recent research has actually suggested that anxiety and depression is in fact more common in children and young people in Northern Ireland and in other parts of the UK as well. Okay, now we obviously need to understand that when it comes to when it comes to the pandemic, when it comes to how children's, young people's mental health has been affected, it has in fact been affected in a huge, well, it has increased in an alarming rate, but also it has, it has had a huge impact. Things have changed vastly for all of these young people and children as well. Now, when we're talking about mental health, when we're talking about getting help and whatnot, we also need to understand that because schools and universities and things like that were closed down, usually when you go to schools, usually when you go to university or whatever it is that you go to, you have all these counseling services, you have a counselor and whatnot. And usually because of that, sometimes when you have trauma, when you are going through things like anxiety and depression, you can actually get diagnosed because you talk to your school guidance counselor or your counselor, whatever it is, you still talk to relevant people. But the thing is, because of the pandemic, because of how the country has been closed down and how we haven't really been to school, our kids haven't been to school and whatnot, that has actually gone undiagnosed, right? So even if you were in this terrible situation, even if you were in some sort of situation that you really wanted to get out of, chances are you can't really get out of it, and you can't really get help either, because we haven't had those same resources that we had pre-COVID, during COVID, right? So that has in fact caused a huge disadvantage when we're talking about mental health, when we're talking about how how health services and everything hasn't been as widely, children haven't been as widely exposed to it as they were way before the pandemic. So those are also huge concerns that are there, especially when it comes to the mental health of young people during the pandemic. Now make sure you stay tuned, because I do have a lot to talk about. This is something that's very important, because ultimately this is our future generation. Okay, I mean, all these children, young people as well, they are our future. So obviously we do have a duty, we do have a role to talk about it, to make sure that they get the help they need, and to make sure, to make people aware as well, because a lot of these problems that are there in society, they in fact go undiagnosed. And right here on Relax Radio, we have conversations about all of that, regardless of whether it's health, science, fitness, technology, whatever it is. We have conversations about everything in society to definitely make sure that you all get we all get the help that we need, and also that we make everyone aware of everything that is happening in the world. Now make sure you stay tuned, because I'm going to head into a small break, and right after that we'll be back to keep talking about how the pandemic has in fact affected young people's mental health and what it means for them in the future when they're getting jobs.
Now, there's a lot of conversation around who pays more taxes, if it is the rich or if it is the poor, right? But when you are basically going out and during a day, you go to a restaurant, you have to pay taxes there. If you buy a car, you have to pay taxes there. So why is it even a conversation that, the rich pay less taxes or the poor pay more taxes? Why is it a conversation like that?
Because it's true, the rich generally pay less tax. A rich person walks into a Tesco's or a Sainsbury's, they're not going to get a different bill than another person, right? They're still going to pay the same VAT on those goods, they're still going to pay the same thing. So that's all the same. However, the differences come in if you can pay yourself from your own company, you can structure it in a way that you pay less income tax through paying a bit of salary, paying dividends and so forth, and then also deferring income. Also, your pension payments or contributions can be different. So that increases your tax sort of gap, if you want to use it that way. Where a PAYE person just gets paid salary and bonus. And now those are the most highly taxed sources of income in the UK, definitely, in the UK. We've seen it, right? If an owner of a large public traded company does something wrong, irrelevant of what that company does or how valuable that company is, the stock generally falls into a pool of nothing, right? Because in a public company where the stock is traded openly on the stock exchange, the value of that stock is driven by supply and demand, it's driven by emotion, it's driven by news, it's driven by quite a lot of variables over and above the actual accounting or total net worth of that company. I mean, we've seen it, right? If an owner of a large public traded company does something wrong, irrelevant of what that company does or how valuable that company is, the stock generally falls into a pool of nothing, right? And the company may still have value. It may still be doing quite a good things.
And it gives them something to look at, and it makes them laugh. It makes them laugh. So that's why I do it.
Oh, and it could be a really good pickup line as well. Ladies who ask, "Hey, excuse me, so why are you wearing something so colorful?" I mean, hey, you can always have something up on your sleeve. I mean, got me thinking. You want to stand out. Why do you want to stand out though so much, especially with these kind of shirts when you're riding? There must be a purpose behind it, right?
Well, when you say a purpose, Nick, what I do, I wear the shirts, mainly one because they're nice and bright, so they make me visible, especially if I'm riding on the road.
Okay. I mean, yeah, that's very important, right? Because you want cars, yeah.
Very important. And also, like, people see me in like calves, and perhaps I shouldn't be saying this on air, I suppose, but in the bar afterwards.
All right.
And it gives them something to look at, and it makes them laugh. It makes them laugh. So that's why I do it.
Oh, and it could be a really good pickup line as well. Ladies who ask, "Hey, excuse me, so why are you wearing something so colorful?" I mean, hey, you can always have something up on your sleeve. I mean, you look like a guy who would do.
You know me too well. You know me too well, Nick.
Welcome back to the show. It is your girl Sarah right here on Relaks Radio. Now you're tuned into the sunrise, and I'm very, very excited to be here. You're here in the first hour of this show, and like I said, we have a lot to be talking about. Okay, so make sure you stay tuned because, like I said, we're going to be talking about so many different interesting things. From mental health to books you could read, ways in which you can enjoy the summer. So make sure you stay tuned because there are so many different things that we'll be talking about as well. Okay, but also before I get into the conversation, I just want to quickly remind you that you can be a part of the show. All you have to do is just text me on 078-52473473, and you can in fact be a part of the show. And I would like to say I'm very excited to know your thoughts, your opinions. If you have any experiences that you want to share with me, make sure you do that because Relaks Radio is in fact the right place to do that. Relaks Radio is in fact the right place to share your thoughts and opinions and everything related to your perceptions on what we are talking about. So make sure you do that. And also, because we're having such an important conversation, feel free to share our videos with your friends, your family, especially if you know people who can relate to what we're talking about right now. We'll make sure to share them so that it helps them as well. So make sure to do that. But also want to quickly remind you that you can in fact download or you can follow us on our socials, which is Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. And you can in fact follow us on our socials, or rather follow us, but you can also download our app rather, which is available on both the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store, so you can listen from either your iOS device or your Android device. Okay, so make sure you do that because that is definitely going to help you stay in touch. That's definitely going to help you understand a lot of different things as well. So make sure you stay tuned. But right now, let's actually get back into this conversation. So earlier we were talking about the mental health of young people during the pandemic and how things have relatively gotten worse for them because of the fact that they couldn't access guidance counselors, counseling the same way they used to before the pandemic, and also the fact that they had to deal with the loss of job and the loss of incomes, loss of family, other so many different things that a lot of us had to go through. And I was also talking about how it in fact has a much bigger effect on younger people than on the rest of the population. Now let's actually talk about what actually worsened, what factors in fact worsened the mental health during the pandemic. So obviously the number one thing that comes to mind is in fact social isolation. And I'm not like the only one who believes in this, and I know I'm not wrong when I say that it has in fact affected a lot of us negatively. And earlier we were talking about, not earlier, but actually a few days back, we were talking about the pandemic brain and what you can actually do to get rid of it. And when we were talking about the pandemic brain, we were talking about how our brain structure has in fact changed because of the pandemic, and how because of isolation and everything we've had to deal with a lot of change. So obviously, because we've seen physical change in the brain as well because of social isolation, we know that it is in fact quite detrimental. We know it has had a lot of negative impacts. So just wanted to remind you that before we get into more detail about the social isolation, that our brain itself has in fact gone through a lot of change, especially during this pandemic, right? So social isolation has, or lockdown has brought social isolation to many people, particularly people who live alone or those who have been shielding, right? And the thing though is, when it comes to social isolation, it's in fact an objective measure, right? Because while some people may or may not feel the subjective feeling of loneliness, some people may feel it as well. So in fact it is something it is in fact something subjective. Some people did feel lonely, some people didn't feel lonely. I for one have I for one actually felt really really lonely. And I have to say, I did miss hanging out with my friends. I did miss going out and enjoying my life. I mean, come on, 20 is all about enjoying your life, right? But obviously, the pandemic was like, I don't think so. And now I'm just stuck at home. So, um, like I said, for a lot of people, they felt lonely, they felt very isolated. But for some other people out there, they didn't actually feel that, right? So surprisingly though, the proportion of people reporting that they feel lonely, often or always during lockdown, has actually been quite similar to the pre-pandemic, right? Which is around 5%, and that's roughly about 2.6 million during April. Now, the groups that have been disproportionately affected by loneliness, in fact, include working age adults that are living alone, and those in poor health, and people in rented accommodation. Okay. Now, social isolation has been potential for a lot of other detrimental effects other than loneliness as well. And I think you know what I'm talking about, because I'm talking about things like abuse, domestic violence, and that is what I'm talking about, right? So while it has mentally affected a lot of us in terms of loneliness, in terms of anxiety and depression, it has also affected a lot of other people who are living with their abusers. Especially if it's your family that's abusing you, or your significant other that you live with that is abusing you, they have been in a lot of danger as well, right? Now, for example, there have been serious concerns about victims of domestic abuse being locked down with their perpetrators. And a report by MPs actually found 16 people, that's 14 women and 2 children, were in fact killed in the first 3 weeks of the lockdown. Okay, and obviously, what we need to keep in mind is the fact that calls to the national helpline refuge were in fact 49% higher than usual. So there has in fact been a huge increase in terms of domestic violence, in terms of asking for help, and even in terms of deaths that have happened due to domestic violence. And this is not the first time we've heard of domestic violence as well. That's a whole other crisis that Britain really, or the United Kingdom really needs to deal with, because it is in fact increasing at an alarming rate because of the pandemic, because of how we've all been stuck at home with with everyone at home, right? So obviously that is in fact a very scary and traumatizing situation if you are in that situation. And that is why that is something that really really needs to be dealt with as well. Now, the second factor that has in fact worsened mental health during the pandemic is obviously job and financial losses. Now, ironically though, in the midst of all of this, in the midst of people losing their jobs, people dying, and people losing their loved ones and whatnot, the world actually gained 5.2 million millionaires during the pandemic. And that just goes to show how there is this huge wide or rather wide inequality between the rich and the poor all over the world. It's not just here in the United Kingdom, but anywhere in the world. There is in fact this huge gap between the rich part of society and the poor part of society. And it's quite ironic, because while some people are struggling to make ends meet, while some people are struggling to pay rent, to find food to eat, to survive, while they've lost their jobs and whatnot, there are other people out there who are just investing in, they're investing in clubs, not clubs but clubhouses, rather. That's what I was going to say. They're investing in clubhouses, they're investing in holiday states and whatnot. And it has in fact been a truly trying time for a lot of us. And it's just really crazy when you think about how the world functions, right? I mean, it's just how capitalism works. So there has in fact been a huge rise when it came to a lot of people who became millionaires last year. So that was 5.2 million millionaires during a pandemic, right? But actually, the economic impact of the lockdown has actually hit people unequally. Now that's what I was telling, that's what I was talking about as well, right? It has caused immediate impacts on mental health. And the Mental Health Foundation actually reports that over a third of people in full-time work surveyed were concerned about losing their job. And mental health impacts on people who were unemployed were widespread and severe, right? So when it comes to a pandemic, when it comes to a situation like this, a lot of us lose that stability, lose that security that we had in our jobs, right? Because when it's a completely normal situation, when things are functioning normally, you're going to have your job, that nothing bad is going to happen. So that you'll still have your job. But the thing is, when it is a pandemic, when so many things are changing at such a fast time period, things are changing so fast, you're actually quite unsure as well as to whether you will still have that job. You're quite unsure as to whether you can still have you whether you can still find security in that job. And that's what a lot of people have been facing as well, because they've had to deal with pay cuts, either was pay cuts or losing their jobs. And it has in fact been a really really hard time for a lot of people. And especially if you're the primary caregiver, if you are the breadwinner of the family, losing your job is definitely going to have much worse mental effects on you as well, because you're constantly thinking of, how am I going to provide for my family, because I don't even have a job now? How am I supposed to take care of all of these people, because I don't really have a job now? So, a quarter actually reported not coping well with the stress of the pandemic, and that was twice as many as those in employment. And almost half were, in fact, very worried about not having enough food to meet basic needs. And one in five people, in fact, experience suicidal thoughts. So, this is what I was talking about earlier as well. You have this huge division in society, the rich and the poor, and the inequality gap, between those two groups is in fact so wide that while some people are enjoying their lives, and they're thinking of what next investment they're going to make, some people are struggling to even find food to survive for the day. Just to get through today, they don't have food. And it's in fact been really really tough for a lot of people out there. Now, another thing that people had issues with, something else that exacerbated or triggered your mental health problems, was in fact the housing insecurity and the quality. Now, people's housing and their ability to afford housing are in fact strong influences on mental health. Like, I think that's a way you sort of that's a way you make yourself stable, right? If you can afford a car, or if you can afford a house, that's your message to yourself that, okay, things are getting better, I can survive on my own, I can become independent, and I'm doing a good job. Now, obviously, when getting a house and having good housing and having good quality when it comes to housing is in fact a huge sign of stability. Now, when we lose that, that in itself just shows how we had to cope with the fact that some of us even lost our houses, right? Now, I know there was an eviction ban and whatnot, but despite all of that, some people still, the homelessness did increase, especially because of domestic violence and so many other things. People did leave their houses, people were sleeping on the streets. So because of that, that has affected their mental health as well. Now, especially people who rent have experienced greater financial impacts during the pandemic than those who own their homes. And another example for a driver of poor mental health, that is socioeconomically patterned as well, right? So we see how, when it comes to how much money you earn, when it comes to how much of salary you have, we see how those things in fact directly trickles down to what we own, our assets, like our house, our car, and how we can in fact try to make our lives better. So obviously that has had a huge impact as well. Now, the loss of coping mechanisms is in fact another one of the biggest drivers of mental health becoming much much worse during the pandemic, because in addition to in fact presenting new or enhanced stresses, the pandemic has in fact diminished many of the mechanisms people typically use to cope with stress. And that is what I'm talking about when I say, going out and meeting your friends. Now, most people actually cope with all the burden they have, they cope with all the problems they have. By keeping in touch with their friends and family and taking daily outdoor exercises. They go, they exercise, they try to keep it out of their mind and whatnot. Now, this has actually helped nearly half of the adults surveyed, but obviously because of the pandemic they haven't actually been able to do that. I mean, obviously, virtual, you've been talking to your friends and hang out with your friends and family on a virtual platform, but that feeling is in fact very very different from the actual feeling that you get when you're hanging out with your friends in real life. And work has also in fact been very important, with the value for mental well-being in fact extending beyond the financial benefits. So there has been a lot of questions, there has been a lot of issues, especially when it comes to all these factors that has in fact driven the mental health of young people to get worse during this pandemic. But make sure you stay tuned, because I'll be back in a bit to keep talking to you about this problem and what we can actually do to make it better. But until then, make sure you stay tuned.
One of the easiest ways to increase your net worth is to ensure that you have higher cash flows. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to not buy things on hire purchase, not buy things over months and months because you can't afford them now, but you want it. It's kind of that delayed gratification. Rather than buy that couch, that car, that stereo, that computer, whatever item, and pay it off over 12, 24, 36 months at an interest rate, rather invest that money, make do with what you've got, and then after 12, 24, 36 months, take the money that you've now invested and buy that good. An asset could be anything that appreciates or reduces a tax bill. So it could still be a liability, but it reduces their tax bill. And I'm not going to go into the technicalities because that's out of our remit here. However, for our use or our purpose, what we are talking for the listeners here is I would put this definition of an asset forward. An asset is anything that increases your income. Anything.
Now, there's a lot of conversation around who pays more taxes, if it is the rich or if it is the poor, right? When you are basically going out and during a day, if you go to a restaurant, you have to pay taxes there. If you buy a car, you have to pay taxes there. So why is it even a conversation that, the rich pay less taxes or the poor pay more taxes? Why is it a conversation like that?
Because it's true, the rich generally pay less tax. A rich person walks into a Tesco's or a Sainsbury's, they're not going to get a different bill than another person, right? They're still going to pay the same VAT on those goods. They're still going to pay the same thing. So that's all the same. However, the differences come in if you can pay yourself from your own company, you can structure it in a way that you pay less income tax through paying a bit of salary, paying dividends and so forth, and then also deferring income. Also, your pension payments or contributions can be different. So that increases your tax sort of gap, if that, if you want to use it that way. Where a PAYE person just gets paid salary and bonus. And now those are the most highly taxed sources of income in the UK, definitely, in the UK.
Welcome back to the show. It is your girl Sarah right here on Relax Radio. Now, we're talking about the mental health of young people during the pandemic and how it has, in fact, been, how it has, in fact, taken a negative turn and what it means for all these young people who are going out into the world to find new jobs, especially after the pandemic, and what it means for them. Now, that's what we're talking about. And I am Sarah, very excited to be here. I'll be keeping you company all the way until 9 a.m. And I do have a lot of fun and interesting content heading your way, so make sure you stay tuned. But before we actually move into this conversation, just want to quickly remind you that you can be a part of this show. All you have to do is just text me on 078 and you can in fact be a part of this show. So make sure you do that because I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts, your experiences, your opinions, and I would love to share it with everyone who's listening in as well. So make sure you do that because I would absolutely love to hear what you have to tell me as well. And also make sure to download the app, which is available on both the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. And make sure to follow us on our socials as well, which is Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. And I know you spend a lot of time on those apps, so I know it's not definitely going to be too hard for you to follow. Go click that follow button. It's just one button, and when you do go click the follow button, I know your day is going to get so much better because your day is going to be filled with so much of interesting and fun content that will, in fact, help you, be much, much more aware about everything that is happening in the world right now. Now, let's actually get into this conversation, right? Because we were talking about mental health of young people during the pandemic and what that means when it comes to future jobs for the young people, especially after the pandemic, what it means for them. So more than 1 in 4 young people are in fact worried about about poor mental health, and and they're worried about the fact that it will in fact affect their ability to find work after the COVID-19 pandemic. And this was actually according to a report. Now, after opening up the British economy this spring, the Resolution Foundation said that young workers were still suffering from a heavier toll than their older colleagues and were paying a heavier price with their mental health. And let's kind of be honest, okay? I don't know if this is your opinion, but this is in fact my opinion. But we're talking about young people, right? And the thing is, when you're young and you're not used to these experiences, it can in fact be much, much more stressful. And let's also talk about how there is in fact a huge difference um between the society that is present for younger people nowadays versus the society that was there back then for older people who used to be young back then. But you get the gist of what I'm saying, right? Because obviously the situation has in fact changed a lot. The society nowadays is in fact, society nowadays is in fact very competitive, very capitalistic, and it is very competition driven, right? People are in fact driven by competition. So obviously the society, the environment that they work in right now is in fact very, very different from the environment that was there, say, about 20, 30, 40 years back, even. Right. So obviously, because of that, even before the pandemic, we know that the society, or we know that society was in fact quite competitive. We know that there was a lot of stress for a lot of people who worked in especially back then, when we're talking about society back then, things weren't as stressful as it is right now. Obviously, things weren't as expensive as it is right now as well, and there was a huge inflation. I mean, there was inflation, but the thing is, the effects of all of that, everything that happened in the past, in addition to the economic crisis we have, in addition to the pandemic, in addition to the environmental pollution that's going on as well, because of all of these problems, society has changed a lot for all the young people nowadays, right? And they in fact have much, much more harder problems to solve. They have much more harder things to deal with as well, because when you were buying a house when you were like 20 or something, it wasn't that expensive. But now things are in fact expensive. Things are in fact much, much more pricier than it used to be. So obviously we understand that when we're comparing these instances, young people of back then versus young people of right now, there's in fact a huge difference, because young people back then didn't have as many problems as young people nowadays have as well, right? So it's actually said that it's actually said that 18 to 24-year-olds were in fact 2.5 times more likely at the end of May to be out of work or still on furlough than any other age group. And this is even after reopening the hospitality venues across the United Kingdom as activity, returns to Britain's high streets. So obviously that is in fact quite scary, and it's alarming as well, because they're 2.5 times more likely by the end of May to actually be out of work, right? And or they were likely at the end of May to be out of work. And because we're in July right now, because of how things have changed, because this research was done back then, and we're talking about how things have changed from that moment onwards. Things have gotten much, much worse, because those statistics have been confirmed as well. Right now, this actually comes amid mounting concerns over the lasting impact of the crisis for young people after almost 15 months, or maybe even a bit more, of unprecedented disruption to their education and the start of their working lives. And there was actually research published on Monday by the Institute of Fiscal Studies, warning that those getting on the career ladder for the first time could bear the scars of COVID recession for years to come. And I think it's quite sad how we tend to underestimate how hard things are for a lot of young people right now. We underestimate it a lot, and we think life is in fact much easier for them because they have all of these, because technology is so developed, because things are much easier than it was back then. But that doesn't mean that life has become easier. That doesn't mean in no way does it mean that when it comes to all the problems that we deal, when it comes to all the struggles we go through, that it has in fact gotten easier, because that is definitely not the case. Now, like I said, that despite the opening up of the economy, the Resolution Foundation actually said that more than 1 in 5 adults, actually aged 18 to 24, reported struggles with mental health last month. So that's about that's quite a huge, or that's an alarming rate of young people struggling, because we understand now, or we realize that we actually need to start paying more attention to mental health. We need to make sure that we address these problems, because if we don't address these problems right now, it is in fact going to get worse, right? And we also need to understand the fact that when it comes to COVID-19, when it comes to all the scars and all the trauma that we had to go through and how we've all had to deal with it as well, it's in fact been very, very trying, right? Now, in a survey that was there with more than 8,000 adults that was undertaken by YouGov on behalf of the think tank and the Health Foundation charity, fewer than half, which is about 48%, said that their mental health was good. Now, this, when you compare this with a much higher rate of 64% for 55 to 64-year-olds, it's in fact quite a large number, right? Because even less than half people actually said that they're okay with their mental health, that their mental health is okay and that they're functioning fine. So that just says the rest of them aren't really functioning that well, because 52% actually think that their mental health isn't good, that they're not doing well, and that's what they're saying. So obviously it is in fact much larger than much larger than half of the youth population. Now, more than 1 in 4, which is about 27% of 18 to 24-year-olds, actually said that they were very, very worried about finding a job in the coming months because of their mental health, which is compared with about 1 in 5 people aged 35 to 54, and only 1 in 10 to 10% to 1 in 10 to actually 55 to 64-year-olds. So as the age gap grows, as the age gap increases, the number all obviously reduces as well, right? And I think another reason as to why they fear this so much is in terms of experience, in terms of who you would recruit for a job. Things are very, very different, right? Because obviously if you are an older person with more experience, and if the economy is going through recession, or there is an economic foreseeable economic depression, if that is the case, then chances are you would recruit people who've had more experience in the industry. You would recruit people who have a better knowledge of what they're doing, right? And chances are then in that case that poor people, not poor people but rather young people, wouldn't necessarily get that job because of the lack of experience. So there are other factors like that that come into play as well. And the other thing I feel like we need to understand is the fact that a lot of these young people might in fact be breadwinners. They might in fact be not necessarily a breadwinner, but also someone who makes a huge contribution for their family, or even they might be married and having their own family. So if that's the case, and young people are finding it so hard to find jobs, and they think that that their change in mental health, how the pandemic has affected their mental health, will affect them when they're getting a job, then that is something that needs to be addressed. That is something that really, really needs to be spoken about as well, right? Now, Rukman Semi, who is actually a senior research and policy analyst at the Resolution Foundation, said that young people have been hit by COVID-19 economic crisis, which hit hardest rather by the COVID-19 economic crisis, which has taken a toll on their mental health. And worryingly, some young people are in fact struggling even while the economy is recovering, and they're fearful about their career prospects. And she also said that these fears must not actually be underestimated. And I think even when it comes to young people, that is something a lot of older people do, right? We tend to underestimate the experiences. We tend to underestimate what they're saying. And we think, oh, you're young, so you don't know anything about it. So, you're probably just overestimating this whole thing and exaggerating it as well. And what a lot of older people rather do is they underestimate what young people say. And obviously as someone who's young and who has been there, it can be frustrating at times, because sometimes I've been through that experience, I've lived through that experience, and sometimes I'm not exaggerating about it, but that's just how it is. And because young people are underestimated a lot, there's also that whole prospect of just because because they're underestimated, that you're not necessarily going to focus on their problems as well. And that is something we have seen happening for a while now. We've seen how young people often get underestimated, and because they're underestimated, they don't necessarily get all the help and the resources that they ask for. And that is a huge, huge problem as well. Now, make sure you stay tuned, because we will be talking about all of that after this small break. But until then, make sure you stay tuned.
The valuations that you place on an asset are always behind you. It's always in hindsight. It's never in front of you. And that's one of the challenges, right? Because you're
Yeah.
always valuing what happened yesterday, and what you need is what's going to happen tomorrow. What am I saving or investing for? Why am I doing it? When will I need the money? And how much money do I need? Yeah. So that's quite important, because when you're looking at your net worth, you got to start with saying, well, what do I want my net worth to be, so that there's a goal, and then work backwards. How do I get there? And if I can start with £50 or $50 a week, if I save that every week, and you can go online and use calculators online. I don't have to teach you the maths behind it, but you can say, okay, and if I get a 3% return and I put this away for how long will it take to reach my goal? And that's called just this basic cash flow projection calculations. And it's what we use in financial planning all the time. What we say to clients is we say, okay, what is your goal? What is your objective? Where do you want to go to? And we discuss that in a lot of detail and over most of the meeting. And then the rest of it is saying, okay, in your exact circumstances, with your risk profile, with how you feel about investments and pensions and taxes and where you are and who you work with, and your education level or your lack of education, or how involved you want to be. There's a lot of variables that we take into account, and then we say, okay, here's a plan. You start like this, that's great. And then we review it all the time, and we say, okay, we need to increase it, we're on track, we're not, this is what is happening. Because remember, when you're dealing with assets, the valuations that you place on an asset are always behind you. It's always in hindsight. It's never in front of you. And that's one of the challenges, right? Because you're always valuing what happened yesterday, and what you need is what's going to happen tomorrow. So that's a struggle. Yeah. So there are strategies everywhere from £50 a week up to £100 million, and they're different, right? They range differently from everyone, but and from country to country, to be fair. Different countries have different tax laws, so different vehicles. But from your point of view, at the sort of normal end, I'm not going to call it the low end because I'm in that boat as well. It's as tax efficient as you can get it. That's where you start. You use all the tax efficiencies, and then you step up into different things.
Welcome back to the show. It is your girl Sarah right here on Relax Radio. And we were just talking about the mental health of young people when it comes to the pandemic, and what it actually means for these young people when they're talking about, or when they're considering jobs in the future, and how it does in fact have a huge impact in the future in terms of their job prospects. So that's what we were talking about, and I'm very excited to be here. I'm very, very glad that you could be a part of this conversation too. So if you have any thoughts, opinions that you would like to share with us, even your experiences, make sure you text me on 078 because that way you can in fact be a part of this show. Okay. And also just a very quick reminder to go follow us on our socials, which is Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. And that way you can make sure you are connected to us, that you are always informed and you're updated on everything that is happening right here in the United Kingdom, but also all over the world as well, right? Now, when it comes to Relax Radio, we talk about everything. And when I say everything, I mean literally everything. Okay. We talk about science, we talk about health, entertainment, gossip, whatever it is that you name, we talk about all of it. Okay. So make sure you go download our app, which is available on both the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. So you can listen in from either your iOS device or even your Android device. And that way you can actually definitely make sure you are a part of this conversation. So make sure you do that. But right now, let's actually get back to this conversation um we were having about young people and their careers and whatnot, right? So if you're just joining in, we were just talking about how there has been a lot of research where they showed young people's mental health has been impacted negatively by the pandemic. And even though, even though for a certain time period all these restrictions were eased and whatnot, and we expected young people's jobs to rise or young people to be employed more, that was actually not the case. Now, like I said, there was also a study that was done to actually see how instances changed when we were considering older people and young people, and how sometimes young people are underestimated when they're talking about their experiences. So that's what we were talking about, and let's get right back into that conversation. Actually, now the evidence actually comes as the Institute for Fiscal Studies said that young adults were in fact battling greater challenges in the world of work than their older peers as pandemic restrictions are relaxed. And the influential think tank said that there were growing risks that young workers could, in fact, bear the scars of the COVID-19 recession for several years to come. So, again, that is another concern, because sometimes you think after the pandemic, everything will be okay, everything will go back to normal. But that's actually not the case, because the younger generation has to bear, they have to bear the scars of the COVID-19 recession for several years. So for several years, when they're getting jobs, when they're trying to, apply for jobs and whatnot, they will in fact have to bear those scars of the recession during COVID, and they will have to, work their way through it. And honestly, it's just every time I read news, every time I see all these articles, I keep feeling and I keep thinking that the people who are in charge of us, people who's supposed to, protect our rights and make sure we have equal opportunities and whatnot, that in fact leaving this world in such a terrible place that we have to now just devote our entire lives in trying to rebuild this world and trying to make sure we save this planet. And I think that's exactly what Greta Thunberg also said. She was talking about how our leaders are in fact leaving this world, because come on, what are the chances that you're going to, survive for the next 20, 30 years, right? They're in fact going to leave this world in such a terrible condition that we just, when it comes to us, being leaders, when it comes to us taking care of this planet, we just have to clean up all the mess they made. We can't really develop on ourselves, we can't make any changes, because we just need to clean up all the mess that they made. um and it's just, as each day passes, it just becomes more and more true. And it's quite frustrating, honestly, but I guess, that's just what it is. Now, when it comes to young adults who had avoided sliding into poverty during the crisis because of the government's furlough scheme, and as they chose to delay the start of their careers by staying at home, living with their parents while the pandemic continued, right? So they continued living with their parents because obviously they didn't have a steady flow of income, and they needed to, find a way to not get kicked out of their apartments and whatnot. So obviously that was also they also continued staying with their parents. Now, official figures actually show that under 25s have accounted for two-thirds of the decline in employment in the United Kingdom during the pandemic, and were more likely to be placed on the furlough than older staff. So in an instance like this, you'd expect older people to lose out more, but actually younger people are losing out more. And they're in fact high, and there are higher numbers of young people on the furlough scheme instead of older people, right? The IFS actually said that it was no surprise that young people were more pessimistic about their immediate financial future, given the looming end of the furlough scheme, and as living with parents was not a sustainable or desirable option long term, right? And we also have this whole mindset, or we have this perception where, like, if you're old and you're living with your parents, then you must be a loser, right? I mean, obviously, that kind of narrative exists as well. So because of all of that, it's not in fact a desirable or a sustainable option when it comes to living with your parents for a really long time. Now, it also found the proportion of young adults aged 19 to 24 who did not work any hours per week, including those who were furloughed, actually rose by a quarter, or 400,000, from the end of 2019 to the end of March this year. So that is much higher than for all the other older age groups out there. So, highlighting the rise in young people staying at home as they hold back from getting onto their career ladder because of COVID 19, it said that the share of 19 to 24-year-olds living at home with their parents, excluding full time students, actually increased from 45% to 50%. Now, Xiaowei Zhu, who's actually a senior research economist at the IFS, said that we know that shocks early on in people's careers can have negative effects on their future job prospects, and without effective support, there is a risk that young people today will bear the scars of the recession for years to come. So that's why it's very important. That's why it is, in fact, a pertinent issue that really needs to be addressed right now. Because if we don't address it now, if we don't try to, make the situation better, it's going to get much harder, not just for them, but for the rest of the world, but for the rest of the people in the United Kingdom as well. So that is the conversation on that, and it's very important for us to keep that in mind, especially going forward, especially when it comes to creating new measures to deal with the pandemic, to deal with the after effects of the pandemic, because we're slowly, moving towards going back to normal. Slowly it's happening, but obviously there's a lot of things that we still need to keep in mind as well. So, if you're ever having that conversation with a friend, your family, just always make sure you talk about young people as well. But I'm actually going to be back in a few minutes to talk to you about how pandemic has created a longing in us and how that's bad for us. But make sure you stay tuned, because I'll be back in a few moments.